reopening anytime soon. They're locked in until they get pretty much the whole place vaccinated.
But now, Melbourne is actually tracking worse than Sydney, even though it's about to break the world record for the longest lockdowns. Can you believe that? Yesterday, Melbourne, in fact, had more infections than Sydney, except the Premier didn't have to admit that yesterday because of a very helpful computer glitch. 140 cases went missing, weren't counted on those figures yesterday. An accident, I'm sure. But today, there was no getting away from it. Victoria, again, now had its highest ever number of new infections, 867. New South Wales today had 4 fewer, even though it's got 1.5 million more people. So Victoria getting worse, New South Wales getting better. But it turns out that New South Wales' success, turning around this latest outbreak despite having a softer, more humane lockdown than Melbourne's, well, that's exactly not what the virus models predicted. Here's Professor Raina McIntyre, an epidemiologist from the Kirby Institute of the University of New South Wales, predicting doom in New South Wales just 2 weeks ago.
Our model estimates there'll still be numbers in the high thousands by the middle of October.
Well, the reality looks like being 1/10 of the disaster McIntyre predicted. And the strange thing is that McIntyre is a big media favourite with her modelling, even though she keeps getting it wrong. Here she is in March last year again, predicting doom.
If we do see an outbreak here, how many Australians could be infected?
It could be anywhere from 25% to 70%. That's what the estimates are.
And how many would we lose?
It could be hundreds of thousands of people.
Hundreds of thousands could die. In fact, we've had fewer than 1,300 deaths. And McIntyre did it yet again just before Christmas, which she warned would be a super spreader event, a ticking time bomb, she said, that would spread the virus so fast in New South Wales that there'd be 3,000 cases there by January 8. Well, the true number of new cases in New South Wales on January 8 this year, it wasn't 3,000, it was just 4. McIntyre should chuck out whatever she's using for her modelling. It's at the bottom of her bird cage, I don't know, but she's not alone. Right from the start, the Prime Minister's modellers, his health advisors, they said, well, at least 50,000 Australians, maybe 150,000, would die from this virus. Another modelling had health workers in New South Wales told to prepare for 8,000 deaths in that state alone. Again, wildly wrong, so over the top. And it makes me ask, are politicians being fed alarmist predictions by experts who figure it's actually safer for them to predict the very worst and then be pleasantly surprised than not to be alarmist enough? Well, and their alarmist predictions, said politicians, buying thousands of extra ventilators, thousands of new ICU beds that were never ever needed. And that's because modelling, for instance, in the Australian Medical Journal, predicted that Australia could run out of ICU beds to treat coronavirus patients in as few as 10 days, it said back then. Never even came close. Yet the then Chief Medical Officer, days later, was still running with that fake scare, saying that we could have daily demand for new intensive care beds of 35,000 plus. In fact, the number of people with COVID in ICU beds today, not 35,000, but fewer than 300. Seriously, 100 times wrong. Now, for modelling to be so wrong, so alarmist, so consistently, that strikes me as incredible. And this nonsense is still going on. Example, the Burnet Institute. What is going on with those guys? The Burnet Institute produced more modelling 2 months ago that said Sydney had to have even tougher lockdowns because this Burnet Institute modelling showed that unless new controls introduced at the end of July or others that might be introduced in the future had a major impact, well, their model projected Sydney would have about 7,700 cases per day in 4 weeks. Again, wildly wrong. New infections in New South Wales rose no higher than 1,600 cases, now half that, 1/10 of what the Burnet Institute predicted. Yet this same Burnet Institute is now advising the Victorian government, because failure never stops these guys. It's like the Tim Flannerys of the virus movement. Burnet Institute's latest modelling, accepted by the Dan Andrews government, is plainly crazy. It warns that even if Victoria keeps its hard lockdown to the end of the year, there'll be nearly 1,000 deaths in just Victoria in just the last 6 months of the year, which happens to be more deaths than the year and a half before, when almost no one was vaccinated. So it's plainly nuts. Yet the government's relying on it. And this modelling even says that a slow easing of lockdowns will see 2,200 deaths in the last 6 months of the year. Which happens to explain, perhaps, I think, why Melbourne's about to break that world record for the longest lockdown, while Sydney is about to open up. And there is the difference. The difference is the New South Wales government decided to take these models with a pinch of salt and make much more realistic decisions. Health Minister Brad Hazzard just today explained his justified scepticism of these models that have so terrified us.
More droughts, with more bushfires, with more extreme weather events. And we're seeing that.
Well, that is not Brad Hazzard. But he said he had been told last year that there were going to be thousands of deaths. Didn't happen. He's a sceptic. But in Victoria, the dictatorial Premier Daniel Andrews seems to trust the models implicitly. Maybe because they tell him what he wants. Be tough, Dan. But there may be another explanation. If the experts and the politicians predict catastrophe and then save you from it, save you from what wasn't actually going to happen anyway, they end up looking like saviours, geniuses. You'll be grateful. Oh, save us, Dan Andrews. So let me finish by showing you exactly what I mean. Victoria's Chief Health Officer bragging how he saved that state from all these deaths that were in his models, but were in fact never going to happen.
The Chief Health Officer painted a grim picture of Victoria's worst case scenario if social distancing restrictions hadn't been introduced. 36,000 Victorian deaths, 650 lives lost per day at the peak of the pandemic. With similar scenes to New York, Italy and Spain, Victoria would have needed 10,000 intensive care beds, with 58,000 new cases detected each day.
We know that we have averted exactly this prediction.
That's the game being played on you, right there. And I'll tell you someone else has seen through all this stuff. It's a former Deputy Chief Medical Officer to the federal government last year, right up close to this, Nick Coatsworth. He's now tweeted, at what point do we ask whether the model is built to fit the proposition? The proposition being the one politicians love, death, disaster, lockdown will save you. You are being played on this and on global warming.